welcome back to Season 3 of The International Classroom. I'm Alex Gray, and this episode marks the beginning of a special two-part series on a topic that's transforming education worldwide: artificial intelligence. And today, we're partnering with the British schools in the Middle East to bring you expert advice on using and implementing AI as you prepare for the new school year. So, whether you're just getting started or you're looking to deepen your AI integration, our global leaders have insights to help make the most of these powerful tools. So, get ready to explore practical strategies and inspiring ideas that can reshape how we teach and learn. Today's episode of the International Classroom is brought to you by Smart Technologies, leaders in creating interactive solutions that empower educators and students alike. From smart boards to innovative software, Smart is making classrooms more connected, engaging, and effective. Discover how their cutting-edge tools can transform your approach to teaching and learning by visiting Smart Technologies today. Now, let's dive into the episode. As AI continues to make its way into the classroom, the big question is, how can we leverage it effectively to enhance learning? In this special collaboration with the BSME, we're connecting with educators across the world to share their top tips for integrating AI in ways that are meaningful and impactful. From personalized learning to AI-driven assessments, this episode will give you the ideas and inspiration to make AI a valuable part of your educational toolkit. Let's hear from our international experts on how AI is reshaping education in real time.
I think there's a natural persuasion to come in and talk about product. I want to use this tool or this tool, and I've seen it can work and do whatever that your intended purpose is. And actually, from a leadership perspective, almost exclusively the starting for 10 is not what you want to do and how you intend to do it, but why. Actually signposting the why and recognizing, and this is one that, kick off our chat with something which is sometimes a little bit contentious. Most implementation of change within our school systems gets driven from the top down. It's leadership priorities and decisions. And in most topics, that makes perfect sense. But when it comes to technology, EdTech, your digital strategy, and particularly when it comes to AI, often leadership are not best informed, don't have lived experience of those tools and the impact they can use. Obviously, in the case of AI, quite a few people don't have lived experience because it's constantly changing. And so it's about how do we empower leadership to have the confidence to actually delegate, to empower others through the school to take and run with this. And because there is such a sense of fear as well as opportunity that's aligned when we have the conversation around AI, it absolutely has to be, this is why we want to do this. This is the potential benefit and impact. This is how we're going to measure the impact. And often that's a different kind of measure to the traditional ones of just simply has it shifted a grade point, but much more about time and connectivity, and potentially, depending on the tools you're thinking about, it can be linked to SEMH and all sorts of other bits and pieces. That's the key bit that really needs to be signposted. And then I also think we have a natural persuasion to overcomplicate at policy level. So we have a policy for everything in our schools, and rightly so. But there's a sense of less is more. So I often talk when it comes to a framework, when it comes to setting up an AI policy. And I've seen some that have been drafted that, frankly, they look like they could get a publisher mark and a nice hardcover put around them, and they're not particularly accessible. But what are we trying to do? Well, if we're trying to introduce AI into our school and we're trying to, as a leader, persuade our leadership to run with it, I think we have to keep it simple. We need to actually say, this is what we want to achieve and why. We want to identify some key tools that we want to use as part of a trial. We want to set some guardrails that says initially we don't want staff perhaps uploading any identifiable student data. We want to say anything we generate that's output that might be used in lesson plans or content that's more than 2 to 3 sentences. We want to tag it and signpost it to say this content was generated by X, the same way as we would cite any other sources. We want to make sure that around that, anything that works well in terms of resources, we can share that with peers. Anything that doesn't work, we can share with peers, and we create some way and some structured mechanism for delivering the right CPD. I'm sure other people who've been sharing on this particular conversation will provide some amazing insights on whether it's prompt crafting or effective use of the tools, but we need to create a very simple way of saying we're going to empower people to try. We're not putting an expectation that they must, but at the same time, we're going to capture what doesn't work well so we can take a more subjective view about the actual impact at the end of it.
I think that's a great starting point to leaders out there, school leaders as a whole, who want to embed this tool, as it were. And I think the conversations, I'm trying to see it then as a tool, and it doesn't have all the answers necessarily, but it is a very powerful tool that we're using in the correct way, will allow educators, students, and leaders to do some phenomenal things. So that's, for me, I want to bring this in. What would you say then are some of the common challenges, though, that I'm likely to face, and some strategies that would allow me to overcome those as I start this journey now and I want to see it through then for this year?
I'm not sure that AI is any different to the introduction of any new digital project, part of your school's overall sort of digital strategy, in the sense that whenever we talk about the introduction of new technology within a school, half the cohort say this is exciting, this is going to be innovative, this is going to provide an opportunity. And the other half of the cohort say, hell no, not more. I've got to assimilate and learn and do, and where's the time and so on to do it. So I think the first thing is overcoming fear and the sense that this is new and I just don't have capacity. People often talk about that kind of analogy of the teacher glass is full and you've got to tip something out before you tip something else in. Well, you don't always have the luxury of actually finding ways to do that. So with the why, explaining and identifying that this has the potential to save you time, it gives a degree of a reason why staff might want to dip their toe in the water and have a play with it. But the biggest one for me is, this natural persuasion that we'll have some CPD at the start of the academic year, and then you're on your own diplomatically. And so I use the rather clumsy analogy. I don't imagine there are many football teams that get training pre-season and then are left on their own devices until the cup final. So how do you deliver it? Well, one is about effective signposting. One's about using some of the tools you've implemented over the last few years in your schools that provide platforms for better collaboration and sharing of resources. One, which is probably the most important one, is signposting the flag bearers. The number, I'm thinking in the UK context, the number of multi-academy trusts I walk into and will say, can you tell me who the experts are in MFL or in a particular subject? And we can pull up a list and signpost all those people. But if I turn around and say, so who are the experts on Canva or Century or OneNote, there tends to be a bit of tumbleweed. Well, actually, we build confidence from knowing there's someone as a peer we can reach out to for a steer, for some resources, for some help that doesn't require me having to put my hand up formally and say, I'm struggling. And so actually creating that environment that says, we want you to try, here's the signposting to the resources, here's something where there'll be regular tips shared, good and bad, and here are the people that you can go to within your space that can help you on your journey, actually makes the idea of learning something that's perhaps slightly more achievable with everything else that's on the go in the school.
That's great advice. Thank you, Al. I think for anyone listening as well, just the simplification of that, just to probably hark back to some of the points that you've mentioned there, is have a why. I think we spoke previously about educators and that FOMO, this fear of missing out, but doesn't necessarily bring a why in, as well as then keeping it simple, that it doesn't have to be overcomplicated, but going back, always having that why to circle back to is going to be a very powerful tool for the continuation of this. And I love the sport analogy, by the way. I always try and think about things from a rugby side, and that actually makes complete sense to me. And I see it happen so often in schools, though. So that's wonderful. Before I finish recording, I've kind of asked this one. Is there anything else that you feel would be valuable that you want to add in, or are you happy with how everything is there?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I try and say, which is a bit of a yin to the yang, Alex, in the broader sense, I'm hugely an advocate of educational technology being a lever to delivering improvement in lots of different ways, but with the caveat of when used appropriately, because there's plenty of cases where technology just doesn't add value. But I also think it's really important with so many conversations around the use of technology and within that AI, that we need to remind teachers across the systems that there isn't a prize for who uses the most. There isn't a clock ticking or a sword of Damocles that says you've got to do this now, otherwise you'll be left behind. There absolutely is really good reasons why you need to start reading and building your confidence and skills in the topics and looking at digital tools so that you can make your own informed decisions. but I also don't want it to be a sense of pressure that because it takes you a bit longer to assimilate or identify and weave it into your lesson, that somehow that is you failing on the measure. So sometimes my final kind of adage I always say, less is more unless it's chocolate. Use a few tools well.
On and off since 2011. I worked here in schools, the after schools actually, tutoring English, and then I went and got my teacher's degree, and I went and taught in China. Was a principal for a little while, but ended up much preferring tech leadership. So I was the IT director. Built a foundation school from 300 students to 3,500 when I left, with all the infrastructure. So for the past 3 years, my wife is from Busan, so we came back here and I started my own business where I work with schools and companies doing bespoke development work, data warehousing, customized app development, etc., and AI, I guess, for this market, which I know very well from a teaching and leadership perspective, but also I can bring real solid technical know-how to as well.
Yeah, I can advocate for that. Having seen some of the things that you put out on LinkedIn, I'm like, oh, yeah, blows my mind. Just in terms of, I think I'm kind of one of those that, and I think a lot of probably educators are, that their use of something is good. Like I can use it, but when it comes to then, right, show me or tell me how something works, and therefore you can go further with it. I think that's where I would like, I don't have any understanding of how it works, and therefore the ability to go steps further with it, and that depth of knowledge that you have. It's like, really, really impressed with the things that you've been putting out there, and hence why the conversation and asking you to come on today, because I think you're going to be able to give some wonderful advice for these educators, and as I say, anyone that's going back into education these next couple of weeks. I spoke with a guy in Japan earlier, and he's like, my teachers arrive tomorrow, we're back in school on Friday. I was like, wow, I thought we went back early. That's really early. So yeah, so we'll dive into it, because obviously time is precious for you, and I don't want to keep you too much longer with it. But so for you offering advice about AI, obviously educators going back, the floor is yours really. It's carte blanche in terms of what advice you would give for anyone going back into schools education, in terms of things to focus on, to avoid, or from your opinion, expertise.
So maybe I can focus on a little bit of what you said. AI is moving really fast, but a lot of it is around like these new products and hype around the new things coming out with Claude and ChatGPT and all of that. And it's really cool and exciting. But I think what's really important is we start to look at how AI works. And in some ways, it's incredibly intimidating. These are computers that have learned to talk, it seems like. How the heck can they do that? But also, we know how to talk and we understand language. We exist in that. So my background, way back when, it is as a language teacher. Like my undergrad was in literature. And that's the part that I'm really enjoying spending a lot of time with AI, is not just looking at what Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic think AI should look like and how it should talk to you. It's really looking at, well, how do these systems work? One way that I've been trying to explain it for maybe about a year is, rather than looking at it as a technology, look at it as a media. What does that mean? Well, like a book is a media, film is a media. AI systems are also a kind of media where, they are a snapshot in time. One really interesting way that I thought to think about it was, you'll see I'm using the new GPT-4o or something, and it says that it stopped training in November 2023. That means like that's something that's sitting on a hard drive somewhere that is like a time capsule for that period in time. In 5 years, you can go back in time and find out really like, what is the cultural zeitgeist? What were people thinking about? How have our value structures changed over time since then? This is a bit more of like an esoteric perspective, but I think like AI is much more than whatever the new fancy tool is that some company has released. It is actually like kind of a new paradigm to look at ways of talking and ways of conversing with our technology. So to kind of bring this a little bit more down to earth, because that was a bit esoteric of a response, one project that I've been working on lately, like really lately, and I've been kind of promoting, is this idea of educators actually working to build their own AI systems, which again sounds like insane. And you're, wow, how do I even get started with that? But, something that educators have that I've got like a $10 million salary at OpenAI probably doesn't have is 20 years of experience helping kids learn. And what does effective learning look like? These systems don't really embody that. They say, I need help with my essay about, The Great Gatsby. It says, here's an essay about The Great Gatsby. Good. Go submit it. That's probably the worst thing a system can do to help support my kids. So what can a teacher do to help make AI systems better? Well, I think we need to really start being explicit about like what good teaching looks like. Because the way you train an AI system is you just get examples of like what you want it to sound like for an AI to talk to your kids. They say, I need help about writing an essay about The Great Gatsby. And it says, okay, well, what's something interesting in the book? And then starts a conversation. Start writing those type of conversations. Start not just being consumers, but actually advocating for what this technology should be. It's an incredibly flexible technology that can really replicate almost any type of conversation you want. It can be a good teacher. It's not going to be a good teacher if it's a bunch of engineers designing it. It's going to be a good teacher if teachers are having input and saying, look, I know how to drive my students forward. These strategies work for me. That's really, really exciting. And that's something that I hope people start thinking about. This isn't something that we just consume. We're not just on like getting washed over by the tsunami of progress. It's something that we as educators really are in a position, more so than traditional technology, to say, this is what effective pedagogy looks like. This is how I would like these dialogues to take place. These are examples. Let's try to build something like that.
So, because I think we've also got layers of educators who are like competent and confident with AI, and I would say that I'm one of those. But even from my side, we had this conversation that I don't know enough. I'm going to say like computer science or anything like that to maybe go and think, I'm competent to do that. But if I did want to, I want to go into that. And I completely agree with what you're saying. I pedagogically wise, find it very interesting that a lot of the cognitive science and the researchers have yet to really come out and say too much about AI. And I know it's because about 18 months has to take place for good AI research, but I'm talking more from a pedagogical and a cognitive science point of how we can use AI to develop learning. But if I wanted to get into what you were saying, if I wanted to learn how to do those types of things, what advice would you give me? I've got the start of the new school year. I'm looking for some professional development, something to really sink my teeth into that's going to have this impact. Where would you say is good to get started, and how should I do that?
So Hugging Face is probably like the biggest community around this. It does tend to be a little bit more technical, but it's literally like a website you go to and you say, here's some dialogue that I wrote. Press a button and, it does some stuff in the cloud for a couple of hours, and then you end up with a model. Like it's really significantly simpler than you might expect. I think this is looking at as I said, kind of at the beginning, I'm going to try to do a counterpoint to what I anticipate a lot of people are looking at here. But I think a lot of messaging around AI as a teacher is that you are a consumer of this new technology. How do you consume it well? I think like we're all effective consumers, but AI is also a technology where literally like it's far more accessible to be a producer as well. So start asking the questions. I don't know if you're necessarily going to find like PD in this, but you might find that like this is actually a place where you can really break ground. If you say, no, I want to look at what does EdGPT talk about. There's a fellow from UNESCO who keeps talking about EdGPT. I want to really start defining what ChatGPT for schools needs to look like. There's a very small group of people, like myself included, who are really starting to ask these questions. And I think like those are by far the most exciting questions right now in the space of like AI and education.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. I appreciate you letting me be on the show today. From my perspective, right now, everybody's talking about AI. Everybody's talking about implementing AI. And the one thing that we're all forgetting about, or at least most people seem to be forgetting about, is before we do that, we have to establish what I like to call our philosophical cornerstone. And that would be establishing an AI policy for the institution, and as well as an AI ethics program within the institution. Because right now it's so prevalent, and if a student can write a paper with GPT and submit it, and then a faculty can take that same paper and grade it with GPT, what are we doing here? That's sort of the analogy that I like to use. It kind of puts it in perspective. We need to be mindful of what are the rules surrounding fair use, ethical use. And when it comes to this, making sure that, in order to responsibly AI, as I like to say, having a policy in place, making sure that administrators recognize the need for this, recognizing the fact that we have to figure out how we're going to address this problem, because we're going to be dealing with issues of instructors saying that a student has, used GPT to write their paper, and we have to be able to figure out what the answer is to that now. Otherwise, we're going to have this huge backlash for students, for faculty, and for administrators.
Yeah, I can see that type of thing continuing throughout the year as well. So it's great in terms of going back to school, what we want to start, and the types of things that educators in those first week or two, when we have time together, that we want to be writing and constructing. So focusing on that point then about, you talk about an ethics policy and for AI, what is your advice on the types of things that should go into it, and how would you recommend someone start doing it?
The first thing is awareness. There has to be communication between all cohorts, between administrators, faculty, and students. This problem has to be talked about. We have to recognize that whether a faculty member wants to use AI in their classroom or not, the students are still going to use it. Whether you say you can use it or you can't, they're still going to use it. So it's best for the faculty to recognize that this is something that they're going to have to embrace, and that the students are also going to have to come to terms with the fact that there are rules surrounding its use. When they need to know upfront that what is an acceptable policy and what's an acceptable parameter and what's not. And what's difficult about this is every institution is going to have a different idea of what that looks like. So it's very difficult to have a one size fits all. When it's like you can't say, okay, here's a boilerplate template, plug and play. Some institutions may have more tolerance for AI, some may have less. And honestly, it's up to them to decide how they want to do it. But whatever that decision is, it needs to be effectively communicated to the student population at the beginning of the year. And it's not just about, plunking something in the syllabus and calling it a day, or administrators saying faculty can decide, because that's really not a policy. That's just sort of passing the buck, if you will. There has to be robust dialogue. They have to talk about it, and they have to make some concrete decisions, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for a really, really rough academic year, because education's changed overnight. We've been doing it for decades and decades, and now all of a sudden everything that we've done literally has just been flipped on its head within the course of less than a year.
Do you buy into the concept that the value of knowledge has decreased then because of AI?
I think information is a lot more wholesale because of the internet, because of AI. And I do think, so what I think it has to change is assessment. Assessment has to change. How we look at teaching and learning has to change fundamentally. And the only way to do that, to make sure that students still have critical thinking skills, that they are learning what we need them to learn, is to change the assessment. And in order to do that, there has to be some creativity in the classroom. The instructors have to be willing to really think this through and find ways to embrace the technology. That's my opinion and my platform, because trying to shun it, trying to say, I can't use it, or shouldn't use it, students shouldn't use it, it really is not going to serve anybody. Once the genie is out of the bottle, and this genie is out of the bottle, it's not going back in. Crazy story. And, like, my 14-year-old came home to me last November. He had a smile on his face. He was beaming from ear to ear. And I knew something was wrong. And so I asked him what was going on. And he goes, Dad, I never have to do homework again. And I knew immediately that his friends had shown him ChatGPT. And he had this idea that it was going to do all his homework for him. And so obviously we have this conversation that, no, this is a tool, not a cheat. And so we have to help them figure out ways to use it as a tool, to train them to understand that it's a tool, not, something that's just going to do my work for me.
Yeah, I think that I completely agree with that in terms of a tool. In fact, someone had previously mentioned it as a media, or a form of media, in terms of like technology, the internet, and AI is that it's a tool, it's a resource that can be used. So you mentioned a couple of things there in terms of, one, we want to have an AI policy in place that's coherent for, you say administrators, I say leaders, and then parents, educators, students alike, so that we know what the playing field is, the rules and regulations and those things, so that it keeps everyone in line to be ethical with how we use it and why we use it. And I think then that's the second point you kind of made, is the why. For educators, as we're coming back into school now, we want to be clear on why we're using this, rather than just using it for the sake of using it. So this idea of assessment, which I think is a really big thing, and giving teachers time to think about how we assess students and what we assess students on, I think now is shifted from purely being content driven to now being potentially content and skills driven, with the skills being how they use AI, or how well they can use AI, not just the fact that I can use AI to deliver content, those types of things. Does that sound about right?
It's exactly right. You're spot on. Yeah, it makes complete sense. And, if they can have this framework set up, if this conversation happens at the beginning of the year, they're going to save themselves a whole lot of heartache and headache, because at the end of the day, if things start to get ugly, it's just going to turn litigious. If students start getting expelled for academic integrity issues, there's going to be problems, and it affects everybody. I like to say that we messed up social media, like, what was it, 15 years ago when it came out? And all of a sudden, everybody started using it in ways that it just shouldn't have been used, because nobody really recognized how powerful it really was. And I think, if we can get AI right, if we can understand that this tool has parameters that we all need to kind of self-regulate in terms of how we use it, I think there is, room that we don't have to go down the rabbit hole of a lot of the problems that it could cause.
Yeah. And I think to end on for what you've said there, and this is my interpretation of it, we got told a long time ago, there used to always have that saying that knowledge is power. And then I remember having that flipped on its head with saying, well, no, knowledge isn't power. Application of knowledge is power. And I think we have the same thing with AI, in that, we've got AI. Well, AI in itself is a tool. It's not being, it'll take you so far. Your application of AI, in other words, what we're saying is how we learn to use it and what we use it for, that becomes the powerful tool. So I think, just to wrapping up, if that's our ending message, I think what you've said there is spot on. And for educators coming back in for the start of the year, and what they can be and should be looking at, I think then is profound, in terms of not just, using it, but why are we using it? How are we going to use it? And almost, can we track students' progress? Can we track students' skills and develop that AI literacy policy, those ethical frameworks, to help them develop these things, so that they are in a safe environment to use it?
Precisely. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better.
Sure. So, I think one of the things that me and my team, that we focus on, that, others typically don't and that they probably aren't hearing, is that some of the greatest opportunities for AI exist actually on the staff side of schools, and that these are really compelling and interesting use cases that are largely being overlooked. And that's not to say that there aren't really important and critical things that we have to do in the classroom. I think especially around ethics, safety, authentic assessment, academic integrity policies, all of those things really matter. But looking at AI, not just as a technology issue, but as an organizational development issue, it means that we really have to be looking at every part of the school. AI is very, very good at repetitive, mundane, time-consuming tasks. And if you talk to people on the staff side of the school, they're inundated by those types of tasks. And I think particularly people who are sort of in the profit centers of schools, so that could be advancement, development, marketing, communications, admissions. If you automate some of their most time-consuming processes, that has a very direct correlation to the bottom line of the school. The other use case for automation that I think is really compelling is for risk mitigation. So basically every head of school that I talk to, if I say to them, is there someone at your school who is the only person in the entire school who knows how a particular process works that's mission critical? And if that person were to suddenly depart from the school, is that institutional knowledge saved in any meaningful way? The answer is mostly no. So when we automate a process around the way it's already happening, we create standard operating procedures, we capture that knowledge, we automate typically 80% of the process. And then what happens is if that person leaves, you can more quickly onboard someone into the role. And the last sort of pitch I'll make for staff automation is a staff retention frame, which is that for leaders and for schools, retaining your best staff is a huge priority. And if you can take some of the drudgery off their plate, the repetitive work that frankly they probably dread, they're going to be happier. We see this all the time in our discovery calls, in our onboarding for the automations that we make for schools. There is, I think, this misconception that when we automate, we're making schools less human, when the reality is that when we take that drudgery off someone's plate, it frees them up to do the stuff that only human beings can do, right? That's meaningful, strategic, relationship-based, and you're actually getting a more human school when you automate some of those processes. So that's kind of like my main pitch to schools is to, yes, continue thinking about the classroom, but also start thinking about your staff, because that's low-hanging fruit, and it has a massive impact on your culture overall.
Okay, I'm sold. It sounds like I can. It sounds like I can therefore free up some time for more important things for me. But I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to automate. You've used this term a lot, and I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm going back into school now, and I've got a relatively decent understanding of AI. What advice are you going to give me in terms of where I can go and find these things, or how I can go about maybe trying to start even practicing automation with AI tasks? What advice would you give to me?
Yeah, so that's sort of the catch. And like, this is the reason that most schools aren't doing this, is that you do have to have some technical knowledge to put these systems together. You can go onto a site like Zapier or Make. I'd highly recommend that teachers, especially if they're technical, these are what are called like low code platforms, where you can connect applications together that don't typically talk to one another. So when we're talking about automation, we're basically talking about like a triggering event that then almost like dominoes falling triggers a number of other events to occur, gets platforms, applications that don't typically talk to one another, data sources that don't typically talk to one another, to start communicating. And schools are inundated with data fragmentation, third-party applications, their learning management system. It's this huge mess. None of it really communicates with any other part of it. And the good news is that there are really exciting and interesting use cases for it. The bad news is that you kind of do need a team like ours that has like the technical expertise to know how to connect all the dots, and also the institutional knowledge of schools to know kind of how these processes work, why they matter, and to understand kind of like the lingo and jargon of schools and independent schools specifically.
It's good to know, because it's one of those where people will see it and go, I could go and approach this myself. But like you've said, you need a level of knowledge, expertise, and someone who can continually do this for you. You did mention one other thing there about automation, which was to do with risk mitigation and risk in itself. In terms of then say, right, I'm going back into school. I know I need to structure some form of AI policy, or I need to be thinking about this. How can we use then automations or the types of things that you talk about and that you do?
what would we be focusing on when we talk about risk mitigation?
Yeah, so this is sort of near and dear to my heart because I think there's a really big blind spot for a lot of schools in terms of what the risks are for bringing this technology into schools. So for a teacher who's listening to this, or certainly for school leadership, I would make sure that your head of school, the sort of administrative team, is aware of some key risks that right now are probably not on their radar. The first one I would say is definitely like personally identifiable information going into a large language model. So, student financial information, student health information, like there's certain things we just don't want to go into the front end because they could get aggregated into the training set of the model and end up showing up in someone else's chat somewhere. So we have to be really highly protective and conscientious of this vulnerable group of young people. But schools are largely aware of that one. The ones I think they're less aware of, if I can find 30 seconds of your head of school speaking on your school's YouTube, Instagram, they're then vulnerable to having their voice cloned. There was a school in Baltimore this past spring where there was a voice clone released of their school principal, saying some really awful racist things. That principal was fired. It was a media firestorm. It was later revealed that it was his athletic director that had framed him. And the FBI got involved. Typically, I don't think heads of school even know that this is something that could happen, but the reputational damage was really severe. So it's important for heads of school to be conscious of this, also to educate their communities that this exists so they can kind of pre-bunk disinformation rather than debunking it after the fact. Another one, and this is dark, and I apologize for having to even bring this up, but it's a reality, is non-consensual deepfake pornography. This is rampant in the United States. We just passed through the House of Representatives a law called the Defiance Act that begins to sort of regulate this. But the problem is that young male students are creating, through using AI, non-consensual deepfake pornography of their female classmates. This is a form of sexual violence. Schools, at least in the United States, I know have really good training, a lot of them around consent, but this is not yet part of that consent training and really needs to be. And then the last risk that I would sort of put on their radar is just the risk of inaction. Schools tend to be fairly conservative, large organizations that move slowly, and that's for a lot of good reasons. But simply adopting a wait and see approach or a let's wait and see what other schools do and just copy it is just not going to work. This is moving too quickly. And frankly, so much of the value of a policy is in the creation of the policy, those conversations you get to have. So just taking someone else's policy really robs you of the opportunity to have those conversations, set up those systems, and really meet them.
So if I'm a head of school listening to this now, or I'm someone who's in charge of innovation, AI, and I'm writing this policy, what would be sort of your key points for driving and being a driving force on change? Because you've obviously mentioned some points there that we need to be aware of, and I think it's so valuable that we embed these into our policies so that we mitigate risk. But also, what would be some of the other points if we're looking to make strides forward and be this change maker that we talk about?
Yeah. So, one thing for heads of school to appreciate and for any leader in a school to appreciate, and they probably already know this to some degree, this is a very emotionally charged issue for people. And what that means is that if you come at it from the top down and say, these are the new rules, this is the new policy, you must use these tools, you may unintentionally exacerbate some of the emotional feelings that people are feeling. Whereas if you come at it from the bottom up, and acknowledge that you actually already have change leaders in your school, and part of your job is to empower them, to give them space to talk about the incredible work they're doing with AI, and to spread those success stories organically, to kind of give them a megaphone, give them resources, ask them questions. That's much more of a bottom-up framework that I think people are more willing to go along with. Another piece of advice I would give heads of school, change leaders, is that people are a lot more willing to go along with the change if there are very clear indications about what is not going to change, right? So being sort of an anchor of stability for your school and to very clearly signal this is who we are, these are our values, and even through a really tumultuous period of change, this is the stuff that is rock solid, I think really kind of gives people a sense of stability and comfort and allows them to adopt some changes in a more secure way.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I'd recommend is just keep it really simple. Don't feel that you have to there's a real danger with AI that we just see it as being this big beast, and it seems kind of slightly overwhelming, and everyone seems to know more than we do, and there's a bit of FOMO going on, I think, even now. I think maybe less so than a year ago, but I still do think there's some FOMO going on. So I think the first thing that I would recommend is just start small, start simple. I break AI into kind of 3 chunks, and I always suggest beginning with like number 1, which is just using it to generate stuff. So something as simple as just using it to create a scheme of work on one subject. And it's quite simple now to be able to introduce a syllabus to AI and to actually produce quite a decent syllabus just by giving it some parameters. I want a 10-week syllabus on Macbeth, which is for the AQA GCSE and that kind of thing. Really simple, nothing that's going to really set the world alight. But at least it gets you understanding that essentially what you're doing is you're having a conversation with the data. So you're having a conversation with the pre-trained data for the LLM, for the AI, but you're also having a conversation with the data which you've introduced in the form of the syllabus. So I would say just start to do that. Just start to say, right, I'm going to create a 10-week scheme of work on this topic that I haven't taught before. And then I'm going to create a bunch of lesson plans, and then I'm going to create some resources. And I'm literally going to imagine that I have an assistant beside me who knows a lot about the subject, but doesn't know anything about what I want and what I need. And I'm going to basically learn what works and what doesn't in a very low stakes way, just seeing what happens, because what's the worst that can happen is that it produces something which is no good and which is not going to be very helpful. But at least you've learned something through that process, rather than thinking you need to bring it straight into the classroom and you need to start using it with the students straight away, which is really high risk. Anyone who knows anything about bringing any sort of technology into schools, the worst thing that you can do is start to, without really understanding how to use it personally, bring it into the classroom. Because, I remember with interactive whiteboards, I remember with iPads, I remember with Google Classroom and all of these sorts of things. There is so much potential for it to go wrong. And the very last thing that you want it to go wrong with students. And there's even more potential with AI to go wrong because you don't really control it in the way that you might be able to control an iPad, for example. There is a degree of uncontrollability with generative AI, which is quite fun when you're playing around with it, but you kind of don't want that unpredictability. Even with these wrappers, they're not perfect. I'm sure you probably find, because I know you use quite a lot of this stuff with your students, there will be occasions where it just comes up with something unpredictable. So start small, start controlled, start personal to you, and use that as a way of actually learning and understanding the notion of conversation with the AI.
Fantastic. I think that's a really good way to start for a teacher like me, as I say, hypothetically, who's coming into it. It's like, I've seen all this. Yeah, the FOMO part's hit. I want to get started with it. Now, you use that term AI very generically, and you talked about wrappers. So if I'm someone who's then coming to use this, I don't know where to start. What would you recommend in terms of AI? I'm going to use the word platforms, but AI that's going to be useful for me, that even if I do make a mistake to start with, I'm not going to be put off and then quit. What would be your recommendations of AI platforms to use to get started?
By wrappers, just for those of you who maybe don't know, essentially what that is another layer of behavior modification. It's not even training. Behavior modification, which sits on top of the AI. So you might have the model, which is ChatGPT, and then you might have another layer on top, which narrows how AI responds to you. So rather than you having to prompt, write me a lesson plan for Macbeth, you just press a button or you do some drop-down boxes and the behavior goes on in the background. And it just makes it slightly easier to get started. And that is one way in. There's one way in. You've got Magic School, you've got MindJoy, you've got a bunch of them, to be honest with you. There are lots of different, and they're all, I'm not going to pass judgment on any of them because they are what they are, and some are good and maybe some are less good. But that's one way in. I'm not a big fan of that, if I'm honest. I actually prefer, and I think teachers we're quite controlling. Teachers are kind of control freaks. We are. And I think no, I'm the worst control freak of them all in that respect. I really do like to be which is probably why I've got so far down the rabbit hole with AI, because I like to know everything that there is to possibly know about something. Most teachers will have a degree of that. And so I think that actually my recommendation is always and it doesn't really matter which model you start with, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or Google Gemini, which are kind of the main three big hitters when it comes to these sort of closed AIs where you can't see in the background. They are what they are. But then you've got some open source models now. You've got Llama, you've got Mistral, you've got a bunch of others that actually now are much, much easier to use because they now have a quite simple user interface. All of them are free to a certain point. If you're using ChatGPT or Claude, you're going to have to start paying for more use, but the best models are available free for everyone to use now. So I would always suggest probably, if you're going to start with an AI, honestly, just start with ChatGPT. It's probably the most versatile still. It's probably the most user-friendly still. I don't use it much. I prefer Claude. I just think it's a better AI generally. But I would think probably if I was going to recommend any AI just to play with, like I was saying at the beginning, just start with ChatGPT. It's as good as any, to be honest with you.
And thanks for that. That's a good one. I think, because a lot of teachers, when they're getting into it, they don't know where to, and they hear all this, and it's almost overwhelming for them. So to have that kind of focus on one of the big threes, and it doesn't matter which one you start with. So let's take it up another notch now. Let's think that maybe I'm a senior leader, because I know you obviously have these three areas you talk about, and leadership is one of them with AI. If I'm in that leadership position now and I'm coming back into school and I really want to start pushing this to help me, obviously from a running a school perspective, but also maybe what I do with teachers, what's the advice you're giving me now as a leader who wants to take AI further within my school?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to make sure if you're not the head, so if you're a senior leader, let's say, use a good example as head of sixth form or a deputy head academic or whole school, head of senior school, doesn't matter. The first thing that you have to do is make sure your head is brought in. It's really important. And they don't need to be an expert. They don't need to lead the operational, the implementation or the execution of it, but they have to be brought into the vision. And they have to be part of the crafting of that vision. Because what I'm seeing time and again, and bear in mind, we're only roughly a year and a half into generative AI. We're only a year and a half roundabout since ChatGPT was released, slightly more, but not far off. It'll be 2 years by November. So we're quite early still in the game. What I'm still seeing time and again, even after a year and a half, 2 years, is that unless the head's bought in, what you get are pockets of furtive AI use. Okay, you get pockets of teachers who are using it and it's feeling slightly guilty about using it because the head teacher's not bought into the vision. So number one, you have to have a conversation with your head. If you're not the head, and I would say most people that are coming to me initially are not the head. And the first conversation I have with them is I need to speak to your head. And then when I see momentum when that's happening. So if you're not the head, the first thing you need to do is make sure your head's bought in. The easiest way to do that is to have a meeting with them and show them how they can use AI to support themselves. So make it personal. I always say it's the same with any sort of sales, any sales. It doesn't matter whether you're selling up to a head or I'm selling as a consultant to schools. The first thing you need to make sure that they understand, you need to focus on is how do you make AI personal to their pain points? So basically when we're talking about leadership, bringing AI into a school, it's understanding what the biggest pain points are and how can AI help to alleviate those pain points. So it might be, I don't know, strategic planning. Maybe the head is just not very good at strategic planning. Or maybe the school is really struggling to get really good intelligence out of the data that they produce. Or maybe this head is looking to cut some costs, for resourcing. And you can say, well, actually, we can get rid of this particular platform that gives us resources that we're paying for every year, because I'll show you how you can use ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini to actually create some really good resources. So we can save some money here. So I think that's the first thing that I would suggest. Because the next thing that needs to happen is you need to make sure as a leadership team, you're aligned on the vision. You're aligned on, why are you doing this? Why bring AI in at all? Do you even need it? I'm not, for someone who does this for a living, it's not like I think it's the answer to every problem, because I really don't think it is. And you speak to any of the other guys like Leon, they'll all pretty say the same thing. I mean, it's bad at way more than it's good at. I mean, I use the Pareto principle. I would see about 20% of what I do, it's good at. 80% wouldn't let any AI anywhere near. So if you get that right, then it can be really good and it can really accelerate your productivity. So I'd say when you're crafting that vision, think about what is the 20% in my school that it can impact in. So lesson planning, schemes of work planning, resourcing, data analysis, some creativity, but within quite narrow bounds. I think if you get that right, then actually it becomes much more simple to sell it to the school, because once that's kind of at the leadership level, because the first thing that a leader needs to do when it starts, they're looking at the whole school, is what John Cotter calls establishing a sense of urgency. Because if you don't do that, nothing will happen, because teachers, like every human being, will always take the line of least resistance. And you will always look for you don't want to rock the boat. And education maybe more than any other sector, because, we have our classroom the way we want it. We've got our kids under control. The last thing we want to do is bring something disruptive into our classroom. No thanks. So you have to make it very, very clear to all of the horrible term, but I'll use it, all of the stakeholders in the school. So staff, governors, parents, students, the broader community, that you have no choice. That actually this is the way the world's heading, whether you like it or loathe it. And AI doesn't care what you think about it. Couldn't care less what you think about it. It is here and it's only accelerating, improving and getting better and cheaper. So as a leadership team, you need to make it very, very clear that this is the way that the world is heading. Our students are going to go into the world and they will never know a world without AI. The AI will become embedded into everything that we do, again, whether we like it or not. And so therefore, we have a moral obligation to make sure that our students are entering the world with their eyes open, understanding not just how to prompt generative AI, you can teach that in 5 minutes, but understanding things like deep fakes and voice cloning, understanding why AI is biased, understanding how to work with AI to reduce its propensity to hallucinate. These are all really important things, because if we can empower our students to use AI productively, then actually we're in a really, really good place. So I think that's kind of, making sure your head's bought in, crafting the vision, establishing the sense of urgency, and then getting the right people involved in implementing that. And that should be all the way through the school, not just the leadership team. This might initially begin top down in terms of the vision, but actually when it comes to the implementation, you need to get students involved, you need to get teachers involved at different levels. So thinking about working parties and working groups, get those bits lined up. I think you'll see that it will take on, it will accelerate of its own accord. But if you miss those first 2 or 3 steps, then it's going to be continued, individualized, furtive use, and you're not going to see any sort of wholesale adoption.
So I used to be a faculty leader myself for a number of years, and I know that schools mostly lead from the middle. And so one thing that I would really encourage faculty leaders, middle leaders, and really anyone in a school to do is to refamiliarize themselves with what the technology can do right now. I speak to a lot of educators who tried ChatGPT in the early days. Maybe they dipped into it middle of last year and they haven't updated that much since. And GPT-4o, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and a lot of the more advanced audio and image generation platforms are already light years away from what we could do, 12 months, 18 months ago with these technologies. So things like mathematical reasoning is improved. Things like the logic and the abilities to write more sophisticated outputs is improved. Coding is improved. All of those applications, which are going to affect all of the different subject disciplines, have improved dramatically in the last 6 months. So get back in, refamiliarize yourself with what the tools can do, and make sure you understand what that means for your context, whatever subject you're teaching.
Fantastic. It's a great start. So you have something like that is a wonderful brainchild of yours when it comes to how you can utilize assessments with AI. And people, I'm going to ask you to take us through it, but just as a starting leading for this, do you think then, how can I phrase this? It's like, is AI an important tool for assessment, or can we get away without using AI?
I think there are still lots of really appropriate reasons to not use AI as part of an assessment cycle, and it really depends on what we're assessing. So if we're assessing a skill which is better off left without the technology, then leave the AI out of the classroom if that's possible. And what I mean is, if it's a bad use of the technology, or if it's a bad use of your brain, don't use AI. The challenge is we've got to encourage students to understand when that's the case. The hard part isn't for us as educators to decide, okay, this would be better if we didn't have ChatGPT doing all of the answers. The hard part is to convince the students, why shouldn't I use ChatGPT to do all of the work for this task? Or why shouldn't I use Gemini or Copilot or whatever when it's just sitting right there? So that's the hard work. And I think that's really speaks to the students understanding the worth of the activity.
Okay, so let's break it down into activities. I'm coming back in. We're going to plan our curriculum for the next term, and we want our assessments in there. But I know that I want to incorporate the skills, like you've said, with AI. I want my students to use AI. I'm pretty confident with using it. What's your advice to me for my department? How can I start creating assessments that allow students to use like the skills within AI?
So we wrote the AI assessment scale and published it in its first version last year, and then republished as the peer-reviewed article at the start of 2024. And the AI assessment scale has 5 levels. It goes from no AI to full AI. Now, we use those levels 2, 3, 4, 5 to scaffold and encourage students to use the technology in appropriate ways. Again, just depending on what the nature of the task is. So if it's okay to allow students to do some of that initial work, some of the planning, note-taking, maybe using voice to text and those kinds of other AI technologies, that's level 2. If it's okay for editing purposes, if it's okay for taking notes and turning them into a more fleshed out kind of almost finished product, perhaps, then that's level 3. If it's level 4, we say you can use AI 50% of the time and you're doing the other half of the work or thereabouts. That's pretty arbitrary. But let's say you're doing some work in the sciences and you're analyzing some data. Maybe AI creates the data and then the student analyzes it. Or maybe the student creates the data and then uses AI to do the data viz and the analysis. And then at level 5, we say, look, you know what? You can use AI for whatever you like in this task, whatever tools are available to you. And maybe we help guide them through that process.
Amazing. And from there, what's been the feedback on that in terms of, you say it's a published side of things. What's been the general response from the people that you've worked with and have trialed this regarding that scale of AI?
So we've been overwhelmed, myself, Mike Perkins, Jasper Rowe, Jason McFaul, the other authors, with the volume of people using this scale across the world. K-12, which is mostly my context, and higher education, which is the others. We've seen universities in the US, in Canada, the UK, Europe, in Singapore, and across Southeast Asia, obviously Australia and New Zealand, adapting the scale to their own purposes and aligning it with their own academic integrity frameworks. I've seen people adapting it to align it with ethical capabilities, some of the UNESCO work. We've seen translations of it into in French, into Danish just this morning. In fact, I saw a new translation, Spanish, Norwegian, all kinds of languages and adaptations. And it's great to see the community kind of taking it. And, we open accessed all of those documents. We made it as flexible and permissible as possible because we want people to take it, contextualize it, make it as rigorous and robust as necessary for their different educational settings, and then just use it with the students.
So my biggest piece of advice, and it's the thing that I see not happening across the board in so many places, is using the assistive technology that's embedded within our devices and within the learning platforms, all integrated with AI. If you think about text to speech, if you think about the reading the text on the screen, all of these different elements, double clicking on a word, finding out what it means in that language, then going into a native language and then understanding the terminology and where it's from. All of these things are entrenched with not only artificial intelligence, but also helping support personalizing learning. There have been lots of research done recently, which is all going to be coming out in the next sort of 12 to 18 months from a range of different places that are showing the impact of utilizing these different systems in the right ways. And I think, so from my perspective as a leader, as a teacher, as a SEND department lead, Senkos, or even as a student and a parent, understanding how the chosen device in your school can support any child with their learning needs is going to be really, really important. And there is an absolute overwhelming breadth of different accessibility features across the board. So recently I've done a comparative study between Microsoft, Google and Apple, looking at not only their devices but their platforms. And actually what you get is a really similar range of different services on all of them. Some of them are only cloud-based, some of them are device-based, some of them do slightly more than others for more severe learning difficulties. For instance, Google and Apple do an incredible range of Braille, where you can actually literally utilize your tablet and it'll turn it into Braille. It's all the movements, and it's just phenomenal, the things that can happen nowadays. But being able to use some of those things, even down to reducing the distractions on a screen for some of our younger students, stripping back all those different content and elements, making things into PDFs, being able to change content so it's got a different learner age range. That's something that the company Text Help can do. So for instance, if you've got a group of students in a class, but you need to differentiate really quickly, but you don't want everyone to know that Alex needs a younger read engaged than everybody else, then you can do that really quickly and allow that person to be able to access it. So I think for me, it's using what we already have at our fingertips, understanding it a little bit more. And that takes time. Choose something maybe that you've got the most of. So if you have a lot of dyslexic learners, or if you've got a lot of ADHD, those sorts of things, understanding how those different tools can affect and support those students and also teachers, and then being able to sort of slowly embed them into practices within the classroom. Yeah, definitely. I think just to add to that as well, I think one of the things that we should be asking as questions as leaders when we're bringing devices into the school is it the right fit for purpose for our students? And accessibility and SEN and accessibility needs and inclusion should be one of the questions that's on that list.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you ever so much for that. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
Thanks to Smart Technologies for making today's episode possible. Smart is at the forefront of blending education with interactive solutions that are as engaging as they are effective. From lesson planning to collaboration tools, Smart is helping schools across the globe create dynamic learning environments. Visit their website to learn more and discover how Smart Technologies can support your school's journey into the future of education. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the International Classroom. We hope our discussion on implementing AI has sparked new ideas and strategies for your classroom. If you're interested in part 2 of this series, make sure to follow us so you don't miss it. And while you're at it, you can join our community on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for more updates and resources. Your support means the world to us. So if you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. It helps us to continue bringing you the content that matters most. We'll see you next time for more insights into global education.